Humans, Klingons, and a lot of particle effects are just some of the things to be found in Star Trek Online. But with the game originally releasing all the way back in 2010 and being an MMORPG, is it actually still worth playing in modern times? Well, it's complicated. Welcome, my name's Azidash and welcome to my first look at Star Trek Online. I recently published a video exploring what I consider to be my top 10 Star Trek games. One of the criteria in the list was that I chose not to include any titles which included microtransactions. Now, as can sometimes happen on YouTube, this statement didn't go down very well with some fans of Star Trek Online, with some sharing their disappointment that I didn't include the best Star Trek game ever. Frankly, even if Star Trek Online was the best Star Trek game ever, I still wouldn't have included it on my list, because as is the nature of a personal list, I personally don't like microtransactions, and I'm not going to put a game that features them in any best of list of mine. Alas, I can be objective enough to examine a game with a concept I don't personally like, as I recognise that some do, and that's exactly what I'll be doing in this video. It's also worth pointing out that while Star Trek Online released all the way back in 2010, until recently I had never played it, and this video represents not only my review of it, but my first time playing it. With that said, I want to stress that the purpose of this video is to address if the game is worth playing in modern times. I'll be looking at the story, the core systems and mechanics, the overall presentation, how it's aged, as well as the game's monetization. What I won't be looking at in depth is the late game content, specific builds, or PvP. There's enough of that content out there already by creators far more knowledgeable than I. In terms of getting the game, while it's free to play on both PC and console, in the case of the PC version you do have some choice as to how you acquire it. There's a proprietary launcher version available directly from publisher Arc Games' website, or if you prefer as I did, a Steam version. Now, despite the initial Steam download being just 500 megabytes, once you do run the game for the first time, the launcher initiates another download, weighing in at just over 20 gigabytes. Then, when this subsequent download completes, the game launches and prompts you to log in with your Steam account. Overall, the onboarding process is very simple, and a welcome change from needing to install multiple applications just to play a Steam game. Once you do finally get into the game, you are presented with your first choice, selecting the faction you want to play at. Now, while the overall gameplay experience will be similar regardless of the faction chosen, the beginning of the story is unique to each faction before it branches out into a more generalized narrative structure, which over the many years has been expanded to include multiple episodic arcs available throughout the progression. Of the factions you can choose, there's essentially 3 Starfleet factions, each beginning in a different time period. You have the somewhat current day Starfleet, set shortly after the Next Generation, the original series time period, and lastly, Discovery's time period. While there's no right or wrong choice here, I feel that of all the Starfleet options, the original series starts the strongest, with the first mission featuring a very cool callback to the first season episode, the Galileo 7, with the player being tasked to return to the planet featured in the episode, along with one of the original crew members, all in an effort to rescue several researchers who are trapped on the planet. The Discovery and present day time periods also feature enjoyable plot lines, however the present day one kicks things off with a Borg storyline, and honestly I'm just so over the extreme overuse of the Borg as a threat in Star Trek video games that the ending to that initial arc couldn't come soon enough. Next up is the Klingons, and this is another strong story start, with the player being drawn into a conspiracy in the middle of an otherwise normal prison transfer. Then there's the Dominion, and this one actually provides a pop-up when you attempt to select it, warning that it is for advanced players only. And after playing through some of it, yeah, it's definitely not where you want to start, as despite the story being quite strong, there are virtually no tutorials or explanations included, meaning unless you already know how everything works, the entire opening of the game is an exercise in trial and error. The trade-off here is that you do begin the game with a fair amount of advanced equipment, ranging from better weapons to the Jem'Hadar's trademark cloaking ability. The last faction is the Romulans, and honestly, of all the faction stories, I think the Romulans is by far the best, with the story beginning with the player being a simple farmer to becoming the captain of a starship. It's not that the other stories are bad, it's just that the Romulan one really shines in how cohesive it is, while telling a story that closely lines up with the power creep you experience as you progress through the game. Overall, the story and narrative paths within Star Trek Online are exceptional, and probably feel the closest to the original source media in almost any Star Trek game I have ever played. This is reinforced by a wide variety of original cast members returning to reprise their vocal roles, really helping to make Online's episodic arcs feel like genuine seasons of Star Trek television. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's raise a glass, board a shuttle, and take a look at Star Trek Online. The gameplay loop of Star Trek Online can be broken up into roughly 4 parts: RPG elements, ground combat, space combat, and everything else that links it together. Whichever mainline faction you start as, except for the Dominion, sees the player presented with a set of tutorial missions along with numerous pop-ups which gradually explain the different components of the game. The problem is that the tutorial is just not very intuitive and feels like it was designed more for experienced MMORPG players as opposed to being something approachable to new players. For example, the very first pop-up when you begin the game for the very first time tells you that the trait system has been changed and that all previous traits have been wiped. It then tells you to click the prompt to change your traits for free. Okay, but what actually is a trait? I feel it would have been better to actually explain the system before pushing the player right into the setting. It's not just in the early parts of the tutorial either. There are multiple times the game will tell you to do something, which I can only presume requires an inherent knowledge of MMORPG systems. There's another section in the game where it tells you to return to your ship, but it doesn't actually show you how to do it, which resulted in me literally clicking everything until I found the right button. While I acknowledge that some of the target audience for this game is likely veterans of the genre, there are going to be people like myself who just don't have that base level of understanding. And for those players, it's going to be somewhat of a trial and error exercise in working out how everything works. I will say that most of the UI elements are reasonably intuitive once you understand them, but there is certainly a steep learning curve for newcomers to the genre. Once you do get past the very basics, the game will start you off in a hub of sorts, where you can interact with a lot of the systems for the RPG style customization, as well as participate in the multiplayer content. And on that topic, it's worth pointing out that while multiplayer is available, Star Trek Online does have a fairly deep single player experience, with the majority of the story content being able to be completed solo. If you are someone who prefers to play games alone, you can absolutely do that in Online. Missions, which can be accepted at hubs or other locations throughout the game world, typically tell a semi-contained story and require the player to participate in a mixture of ground and space combat, sometimes travelling between locations within the game's expansive map. There's a mission fairly early on in one of the Starfleet stories, which sees you need to fly your ship to Vulcan, head to the planet's surface to collect a Vulcan ambassador, and then transport the ambassador to another planet, all while thwarting a Klingon attack force and making the later realization that the ambassador may not be who he claims to be. As I said earlier, the actual stories here are very good, and the gameplay experience to weave different systems and mechanics together is sound. However, the individual systems vary greatly in execution. Firstly, there's the ground sections. When you're in a ground section, you will likely be doing one of two things. You will either be running around the area speaking to people and completing basic fetch quests, or you will be in combat. As far as the basic movement and fetch quests go, the game is competent enough. You can move from point A to point B without any major issues, with the player being able to rotate the camera to the best angle based on the situation. There's certainly no advanced movement actions here, but what's here is enough to get the job done. Where the lack of nuance in the ground control impacts the game most is within the combat, and this is definitely the weakest area of the game. While some parts of the game have been modernised over the years, the underlying ground combat system looks like it's from a title much earlier than the original 2010 release date. It's not that anything is necessarily broken, it's just what's here is extremely basic. The basic loop is you aim and fire your weapon while tanking damage until you auto-heal or use a consumable. There's a flanking mechanic which supposedly does additional damage, but honestly in my playtime I never really found it to be of benefit. There's both the pulled out camera and a closer tactical view available, with the tactical view offering a little more control of the aiming, but regardless, what's here from a combat perspective is bare bones at best, and feels more like an exercise in going through the motions to progress, as opposed to genuinely engaging gameplay. Throughout the ground combat, the player will encounter several pickups, with some of them being relevant to the mission and others being tied to character progression. There's also occasional mini-games that appear with the ability to unlock additional bonuses. However, regardless of the way you look at it, ground combat is mechanically very basic and is only improved slightly with abilities unlocked much later in the game. Thankfully, the space combat offers a lot more in the way of depth and strategy. Not only do tactics and positioning play a much larger role, but decisions on which weapons to use at which time, as well as which special abilities to activate, make space combat a much more rewarding and enjoyable affair compared to the ground variety. At the core of the space combat is your ship, with each faction starting out with a basic ship, which can be upgraded throughout the game along with its crew. These upgrades can be things like Starfleet's shield drain ability or the Romulan shockwave, with many more unlocks available as the game progresses. Broadly speaking, in my experience, the free ship the game gives you as you progress scales fairly well with the story-based single-player content. However, for the endgame and PvP multiplayer elements, having a better ship with many paid add-ons will net a far more competitive outcome. Camera and control are quite good for space combat, and despite a lot of things happening on screen throughout parts of the combat, I never once felt overwhelmed, thanks in part to the scale of most combat encounters feeling just right for the stage of the game. As far as the game's monetization goes, look, I'm going to oversimplify things here because frankly, like with many of these games, the monetization and progression systems are tightly coupled but highly complex. The first thing you need to understand is that pretty much anything you can think of in online is for sale. Want to buy a new ship or upgrade the one you have? You can buy that. Want extra inventory slots? You can buy that too. Even just changing your character's name is a paid exercise. And the thing is, none of this is cheap. When I first opened the store, I saw the third featured item listed as a bundle of ships and items for 50,000 units of Zen, one of the game's currencies tied to real money. I thought to myself, maybe that's like $80 or $90. Nope, it's $500. I will give the game's monetization system one thing: the ratio of 1 cent to 1 unit of Zen currency does make calculation quite easy. Now, if you don't want to spend real money, there is another in-game currency called dilithium, which is essentially earned through playtime, and this can then be exchanged for Zen. However, to come even close to the amount needed for that third featured item, based on my very basic math, it would take years of daily playtime to reach it. This unsurprisingly confirms what I believed was the case going into online, that in order to access the best items without years of playtime, you will need to spend real money, and quite a lot of it at that. There are featured events where you can unlock some of the items which can be purchased through playtime alone, as well as promotions across various factions from time to time, offering bonuses like high-end ships just for creating a character in that faction, no doubt to help with the game's overall balancing. There's also several other in-game currencies outside of Zen and dilithium, but these are probably the two most important and most likely to directly contribute to either success or failure within the endgame content. While I dislike microtransactions, loot boxes, predatory pricing, and so on, I will give Star Trek Online credit to the fact that to experience the vast majority of the single-player content, you don't need to spend a cent. In Star Trek Timelines, I hit a point in the game where progression in the single-player game was near impossible without spending money. However, in the case of online, outside of the multiplayer endgame content, it's really only cosmetics and convenience which can be paid for. I'm not going to say I like the monetization system, because I don't, but what I will say is that of all the monetization systems I have seen in free-to-play games, this one delivers quite a lot of value to the player in the form of almost 100 hours of story content before it becomes front and center to the experience. The game's presentation is mixed. While it's clearly based on tech which has not aged gracefully, there's quite a lot of clever use of lighting and camera angles to make the game look better than it actually is. This, combined with a fairly consistent art style, means that while the game lacks fidelity, it does look mostly consistent. I say mostly because there are several examples in the game where things just look out of place. Take for example the Requisitions logo on the Starfleet HQ map screen. Notice how it's a lot lower resolution than every other logo on the map? It's almost like they designed it after the fact, but forgot to export the asset in the same resolution as the other items. Audio design is exceptional and up there with the very best Star Trek games have to offer. Everything from the music to the effects, right through to the excellent voice acting, really are an audible treat and go a long way to making this feel like a very authentic Star Trek experience. Making a decision to play Star Trek Online for the first time over 15 years after its initial release ultimately comes down to expectation management. If you want to play through a set of single-player stories which are among the best the franchise has to offer, then despite some technical challenges, the game will not disappoint you. However, if the draw of the game is the multiplayer-focused modes beyond the single-player story experience, then you need to understand that you will either be spending a lot of time or money to bring yourself to a standard where you are likely to have a good time. Interestingly, while many licensed MMORPGs like The Matrix Online and Warhammer Online enjoyed relatively short lifespans, Star Trek Online is the second longest running licensed MMORPG, being beaten only by Lord of the Rings Online, which released 3 years earlier. This, combined with a fairly steady stream of new content over the years, has helped build a very loyal player base that, while I can't determine the exact number given players play outside of Steam, based on sentiment alone, feels relatively healthy for a game over 15 years old. I think the biggest challenge that Star Trek Online faces now, though, is how it attracts new players to keep the multiplayer element and economy alive. There's no doubt that the game has not aged gracefully in its presentation, and this presentation through screenshots or videos is likely going to be a prospective new player's first exposure to the game, raising the questions if the developers should continue on the current path or begin work on a new game and attempt to lift and shift the existing audience over while providing greater appeal to newcomers. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.